Hey, welcome to week 4. You know what they say, you make it to week 4, might as well just go right to the end of the course. Glad you're with me. This is going to be a fun week. It's going to highlight an approach to psychology that we're calling behaviorism. But what I want to do really in this very first lecture of the week is set the stage and give you a sense of why and how behaviorism was a very strong reaction to a couple of things going on at the time. The time being early to mid 1900s. All right, so let's get at it. All right, week 4, lecture 1, forces of nature. I decided I would inhabit the other corner of the screen for a while. You know, I was getting kind of bored over in that corner, so I snuck over. I hope that's okay with you. All right, here's what I want to do. Here's the story I want to tell today. I want to start a little sort of pre-Darwin, but kind of talking about some of the strong influences of Darwin, and specifically this notion of artificial versus natural selection. You've seen that I've titled this lecture Nature, because this was a time when genetics really started to be known, understood, and the full influence was embraced, maybe even over-embraced a little bit. So let's start here. When Darwin was postulating this notion of selection, and specifically that the characteristics of an organism evolve to fit the habitat, one question at the time was, well, how does that happen? You know, how can an organism evolve its characteristics? And of course, Darwin suggested that, well, whichever one has characteristics that fit the environment best are more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. But there was still that question like, okay, let's say I have a big beak and that helps me survive and that helps me reproduce, but how does that get translated to future generations? Now, Darwin knew that it did. He didn't know how, but he had seen things like racehorses. So this is an image that meant to document 1800s, and clearly there was racing going on there, and there was racing going on well before, and there was breeding critically going on. Now, breeding is what some people call artificial selection. And of course, in the horse racing world, the idea is just this. You take a really fast horse, and if you breed it with another really fast horse, then the offspring are more likely than average to be fast horses. So, you know, assumably that reflects some physical characteristics, the build of the body, the musculature, something like that seems to be handed down, seems to somehow go from parent to child, and, you know, carry on in that way. What we all think now of genetics, but they didn't really understand what it was. Now, that's all fine and good perhaps for physical characteristics, but it also, critically for this course, seems to be true for psychological characteristics. Now, this is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but dogs obviously have also been bred to an extreme degree. If we take a black lab like this, like look how beautiful and black this is. I used to have a black lab, Kaylee. I think of Kaylee when I see this picture, not the duck part. But anyway, dogs came from wolves initially, and people started breeding the most gentle, tame wolves with each other, ultimately leading to a much tamer dog than a wild wolf. And then they started getting even more specific. So they would breed the darkest pups with the darkest pups and do that generation after generation. And eventually, by doing that, we're able to create dogs like these black labs that are pure black. This is not natural, you know. But again, that's a physical characteristic. But the reason I chose the duck picture is the other thing that was bred into labs was for them to have a gentle mouth, what they call a gentle mouth. So if you're a duck hunter, boo on you, but okay. If you're a duck hunter and you shoot a duck, often you shoot them over water or you shoot them you know, relatively far away, and you don't necessarily want to go find them. Wouldn't necessarily be very good at finding them. So the ultimate dog companion for a hunter, especially a duck hunter, was one that loved to swim. Let me highlight that. Loved to swim. Isn't that a psychological thing, what your tastes are? One that had a gentle mouth. So if a duck was in the water, it would go and get the duck, and it would bring it back to you, but it wouldn't bite it. It wouldn't tear it. It wouldn't shredded apart. In fact, labs are generally known as being gentle disposition dogs. And they were bred that way. The gentlest dog, the one that did not eat the ducks, the one that did not scar the ducks, they're the ones that were bred to produce this dog. And of course, you'd like one with a decent nose, because if the duck is somewhere in a field way over here, you want the dog to be able to find it. So a dog that loved to swim, that had a good nose, and that was able to retrieve a duck without mutilating it or harming it. Those, that's a fine blend of physical and psychological characteristics that you want in a dog, and they were able to breed it. So this is what really gave Darwin the original idea that, okay, well, in order for my notion to work, it's just instead of this artificial selection that we do when we breed, there has to be some natural version of that. So there has to be some, if having certain traits is desirable to members of the opposite sex, then that will function like artificial selection, that the couples will select based on who they're going to pair with based on certain characteristics, and that will function the same way. Those characteristics will carry on. So that was Darwin's idea, but here's the kicker. That became really kind of exciting. A lot of people were interested in this. A lot of people were thinking about the implications, and then some people started thinking, well, maybe we should be artificially breeding humans to an extent. So the scientific field called eugenics emerged, that really emphasized genes and suggested that, if we want to advance as a species, if we want the human race to somehow become better, whatever that means, and that's part of the problem with eugenics, maybe we should look at how humans reproduce. Maybe we should not allow anybody who wants to reproduce with anybody who's willing. Maybe we, society, should put breeding restrictions on our citizens. So this opened this huge, you see, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And so you see things in the roots here, mental testing. The idea was, well, wouldn't we rather have the intelligent people breeding instead of the not so intelligent people? So if we could test and find intelligent people, wouldn't we rather have those people as the ones that breed and produce the future of humanity? That's a critical thing, and it really, of course, obviously branched out. Sorry for the pun, but it got pretty extreme. So at some points people would say things like, well, mixed race couples cannot have children or should not have children, mentally retarded children should not have children, homosexuals perhaps should be prevented from having children, because at that point in time homosexuality by many was seen as a problem. Of course, certain, it reached its peak in Nazi times in the 1940s when Hitler went beyond saying we should prevent certain groups from breeding and started literally exterminating certain groups, the Jews being especially high on his list. That was the extreme of eugenics, and it's a really kind of crazy time in a way. It's a hard time to think about because you have people like Hitler doing horrific things based on scientific principles. It's the kind of thing that scientists don't ever imagine happening with scientific ideas, but it sure as heck happened, and it happened in a very extreme way. Okay, so this is the context that really, let me step back. This is the context that really was setting the stage for a push towards genetics and the role of genetics, the role that genetics plays. So that's the role of what we're going to call nature in this course. How do we study nature in psychology? How do we study the influence of nature? I'm going to put eugenics to the side for a second, but just if we're interested in the extent to which something is genetically determined, how can you know? Well, one way, and something you're going to hear of in this course quite a bit, is evidence from so-called twin studies. Twin studies often compare identical twins with fraternal twins, or sometimes called monozygotic versus dizygotic. What that means is the zygote is the actual fertilized egg. And you see with a monozygotic, there's really just one. With a dizygotic, there's two. That's the mono versus di. So in the case of a monozygotic twin pair, originally it's one egg fertilized by one sperm. But then that egg inside the placenta splits into two individuals. Sorry, that egg splits into two individuals, but then they each go off and become two babies, but they have an identical genetic structure because they started out as the same sperm matching with the same egg. Whereas in the dizygotic case, we have two separate eggs fertilized by two separate sperm cells. So really in the dizygotic or fraternal twins, those two children are no more alike genetically than any brother and sister would be. Any brother and sister by the same parents would be. So we get this difference. Here we have two children that will grow up together, and so they'll share the same environment, but they don't really share that strong of a genetic connection. They do as family members, but not nearly as strong as the monozygotic twins, the identical twins. These twins will grow up together, so they'll have a very similar environment, but they also have essentially identical genetics. And so we can compare things like the following. We can compare concordance rates. So what's a concordance rate? Well, let's take alcoholism. A concordance rate says that if one of the twins is an alcoholic, let's say, what is the likelihood that the other twin will also be an alcoholic? Okay, that they're in concordance, that they agree. And you see, for example, with females and alcoholics, for a monozygotic twin, that's about 0.3. For dizygotic, it's lower, maybe about 0.25. That's for females. For males, it's higher generally. Males have a higher chance of being alcoholic in general, but especially for these monozygotic. So if you're an identical twin and your twin is an alcoholic, there's nearly a 40% chance that you as well will become an alcoholic. More importantly, this difference that you see across monozygotic versus dizygotic is seen as evidence for the contribution of genes, of genetic factors. So by looking at those differences, if you assume that the environment of these kinds of twins are roughly equated, then the difference you see should be due to this fact that these monozygotic twins share a lot more genes. That's why the concordance rates are higher. That's why there's a greater likelihood of you being an alcoholic if your twin is. You see this pattern across many things. So for example, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, autism, it looks huge with autism here, major affective disorder, that means emotional disorders, that's like depression, for example, and even reading disabilities. And every time you kind of see this pattern, it is taken as suggesting that there is a genetic influence. So all of this to say that there is no doubt that in a lot of the issues we'll talk about in this course, a lot of issues that have psychological relevance, genes are playing a role. Nature matters. Now the real question though, of course, will be how much does it matter? How big of a role is it playing? And in the eugenics kind of view, the idea was, oh, well, it's playing a huge role. Let's actually, tailor our species via genetics. Again, a little creepy. We'll come back to that. But that was really kind of big, and all of this was kind of big in the early 1900s. People were very interested in genetic influences. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for now. I've got some videos here, one comparing artificial versus natural selection. A couple, these are longer ones, and these are more related to that eugenics issue. They're creepy. So for example, from Darwin to Hitler, that's a lecture that somebody gave, being pretty provocative in some of these things, but if you find that fascinating, I certainly was amazed when I first learned about eugenics and the role it played in early 1900s. So you can check that out. Here's some information about twin studies. And then in readings, again, some more information about twin research. This is actually a journal about twin research in human genetics, just to show you that it's still, a very ongoing area of research. There's a couple of free papers, if you're interested, that you could take a look at, again, if you want to really see the raw science that's being done on this. And then there's a general discussion of the nature versus nurture debate. So I've highlighted nature in this talk. In the next lecture, I'm going to highlight nurture, and I will highlight the fact that this really has become a bit of a battle for psychology, of trying to understand how much of us is determined by our genetic heritage and how much is determined by the environment around us. So to hear more about the environment, tune into the next lecture. See you later. Have a great day as always. Bye-bye.